This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander. It's a pleasure to be here at the Warburg. It is a pleasure to be introduced by a colleague like Alexander, with whom I have so many common interests. So I want to thank the Warburg and the organizers today. It was somewhat reassuring today as I met other participants here to see that I am not the only scholar here who is not a historian of science, because I was a bit, worried about attending a conference like this. I thought, like, I'm a fake here, I really do not belong here. But I think that the conference it's an excellent idea, because it gives us the opportunity to meet scholars from other fields, and I really think that we need to go beyond the narrow limits of national traditions, or boxed in, as it were, fields or disciplines. So let me congratulate again the organizers for a great idea. So today I am going to approach Villalobos and his work as an example of how translation, early modern science, and early modern prose fiction intersect. So that is the reason for my interest in Villalobos, which I hope to make clear as I proceed in my talk today. Let me first introduce you to Villalobos, and then we'll get into further details. Born to a Jewish family around 1473, Francisco López de Villalobos studied at the University of Salamanca, where he also published his first book, the Sumario de la Medicina, in 1498, when he was only about 25. This was a summa, or a summary in verse, of Avicenna's medical works, which also included, as an appendix, a pioneering treatise on syphilis, the so-called Tratado sobre las pestíferas bubas. His professional expertise soon took him to court. In 1507, he entered the service of Don Fadrique Álvarez de Toledo, the second Duke of Alba, and the father of the infamous Duke of Alba, especially in some places, right? Of evil memory, right? And 2 years later, we find him as one of King Ferdinand's physicians, King Ferdinand of Castile. In 1509, he wrote a lively letter to the Bishop of Plasencia that reported news, his impressions of life at court, and plenty of gossip. Villalobos has left a substantial corpus of Castilian and Latin correspondence. Besides information about politics and other events at court, his letters provide a record of his intellectual pursuits and of the mischievous wit of his prose. He comes through as a sort of news reporter, political commentator, gossip columnist, humorous raconteur, and confidant, all of it woven into one fascinating textual corpus that straddles a large variety of subjects, genres, and styles. Villalobos was not one to restrain his penchant for self-deprecating irony and the sarcastic quip about others. Indeed, his letters suggest that this peculiar sense of humor must have got him into trouble more than once, and the life of a Jewish convert in 16th century Spain was never easy anyway. His first brush with the religious authorities came about soon after his appointment as royal physician in 1509. He was charged with sorcery and sentenced by the Inquisition in Córdoba to a period of imprisonment of about 80 days. Although he was released honorably after being found not guilty, this incident led him to contemplate abandoning the court, a purpose that was short-lived but which would recur frequently during the rest of his life. This unpleasant affair, however, did not deter him from making fun in one of his letters of the inquisitor who had persecuted him. He was an inquisitor from Córdoba called Lucero, who was so strict that there was a popular uprising, and he was eventually thrown in prison himself, accused of corruption and being, over the top, really. So you can imagine what he must have been like. So Villalobos' reputation as a diligent reporter and witty storyteller must have made him very popular within the highest spheres at court. The fact that throughout his life he continued to enjoy the favor of the monarchy and many other powerful correspondents and patients demonstrates that his professional standing among them must have been considerable too. After the death of King Ferdinand in 1516 and an uncertain period of unemployment, he was reappointed as royal physician in 1518, and he remained at the service of Emperor Charles V and other magnates during the rest of his professional career. He retired from court in 1542, after which, almost immediately, he published his Problemas, of which more below. Today, I would like to provide a necessarily brief survey of Villalobos' literary endeavors, his aristocratic patrons, and his intellectual affinities. They provide an illuminating backdrop not only for his own texts, but also for the new types of prose that were emerging in this period. His colorful and varied prose illustrates a stage in early modern prose during which different disciplines and discursive varieties appear intermixed with each other before more strict divisions crystallized within the canon. I will first approach Villalobos' interest in Pliny's natural history, and then I will examine the intersection of science and medicine with moral philosophy in his heterogeneous prose. This combination resulted in texts like his translation of Plautus' Amphitryon, the volume titled Los Problemas de Villalobos, or his correspondence, both Latin and Castilian. So in 1524, Villalobos published his Glossa Literalis Imprimum et Secundum Naturalis Historiae Libros, which was a commentary on the first two books of Pliny's natural history. He dedicated it to Alonso de Fonseca, Archbishop of Toledo and one of Erasmus' most prominent patrons in Spain. This was also the first commentary on the natural history published in Spain. Villalobos' interest for Pliny predated the publication of his glossa by at least 23 years. For in 1501 he exchanged letters with another physician, Dr. Gonzalo de Moros, on certain controversial passages where Pliny questions the immortality of the soul. In this letter, Villalobos examines Pliny's text with his wonted irony and wit. If Pliny's eyes could have seen, says Villalobos, and I quote, "the wonderful miracles performed in their days by the disciples of Christ, he would have been persuaded by those putrid and repulsive corpses brought back to life of the indestructibility of the soul and the resurrection of the flesh. And although he was a man of great learning and a shrewd observer of nature, Pliny deserves execration for following in the steps of those philosophers who wrote so much nonsense about nature and persistently proclaimed a multitude of errors which are contrary to common sense. Those philosophers are not to be held as wise men, and if they lived in our time, the mercy of our not little learned contemporaries would throw them in prison, so they would be cured of their madness." Unquote. As opposed to other Spanish commentators, which I will list immediately, Villalobos was more ambiguous and less critical with respect to the otherwise controversial Epicureanism of Pliny. When he deals with the section that denies the immortality of his soul in his commentary, Villalobos merely paraphrases the text, and he neither provides a critical analysis nor refutes its contents. By contrast, the rhetorician Hernán Núñez published in 1544 his own philological commentaries to Pliny, whose doctrines he describes as depraved. In the 1560s, the astronomer and Hebraist Jerónimo Muñoz produced a manuscript commentary that vigorously refuted Pliny's heterodox opinions. Francisco Hernández, the first Spanish translator of Pliny's natural history, manipulated the original into a manuscript version in line with Christian orthodoxy. And finally, Jerónimo de la Huerta, who produced the first printed translation, the first part in 1599 and the second part in 1624, Jerónimo de la Huerta also castigated Pliny's suggestions about divine indifference for human affairs as an absolutely false doctrine. In contrast, as I said, Villalobos' comments never explicitly refuted Pliny's materialism, his Epicureanism, or his skepticism about fortune or divine providence. At most, he concedes that when Pliny made all these controversial claims, the Roman encyclopedists did so hesitantly, dicit dubitative or pro modo dubitativum, he says. His correspondence with Hernán Núñez, the rhetorician, they had an epistolary controversy. They had a debate. Hernán Núñez didn't like Villalobos' edition because it was not good enough on philological grounds. And then we have their correspondence, which throws some interesting light on the background to Villalobos' interest and his comments of Pliny. So this correspondence reveals the authorities that Villalobos had consulted as he elaborated his commentaries and whose protection he sought. We must remember that this is a Jewish convert writing, in Spain, and he must tread very carefully when it comes to texts which lend themselves to, dangerous interpretations, right? Not only had Villalobos dedicated the book to the powerful Archbishop of Toledo, his consultants also included Adrian of Utrecht, who had been General Inquisitor of Aragon and Castile before he became Pope in 1522. One can hardly think of a more authoritative and safe consultant for a commentary on the most controversial books of the natural history. But there were other relevant names in Villalobos' list, such as Peter Martyr and the members of the Royal Council, politics, the university and scholarly and humanism, and the religious authorities. The Spanish scholar Consolación Baranda has recently provided a most interesting account of the presence of Pliny's rational materialism in early modern Spain. One of the most important witnesses to the impact of Epicureanism was La Celestina, whose author was the lawyer Fernando de Rojas, although the first act of that play, or whatever it is anonymous, right? But Fernando Rojas continued the rest of the eventually 21 acts, right? Fernando de Rojas was a contemporary of Villalobos and a fellow student of his at the University of Salamanca. La Celestina was published in the first known edition, dates from 1499, and in the canon it is second only to Don Quixote in the Spanish canon, right? Many view the La Celestina as a forerunner of the picaresque and the early modern novel as well, although this is somewhat controversial. The Mexican scholar Gustavo Illades has traced the Epicurean affinities between Villalobos and Fernando de Rojas, and in turn these two share their skepticism with Fernán Pérez de Oliva's Diálogo de la Dignidad del Hombre, a dialogue on the dignity of man. Composed in the late 1520s, one of the two interlocutors in this dialogue voices a pessimistic view of man that echoes the materialist doctrines of Pliny's Epicureanism. Pérez de Oliva was a polymath who composed treatises on magnetism, the nature of light, and practical handbooks on navigation techniques. Next to Rojas the lawyer and Oliva the scientist and moral philosopher, we find the heterogeneous production of Villalobos in the same period, around the same decades. And there is no better testimony to Villalobos' heterogeneity than the full title of his Problemas, and one needs to take a breath before reading the full title. Libro intitulado Los Problemas de Villalobos, que trata de cuerpos naturales y morales, y dos diálogos de medicina, y el tratado de las tres grandes, y una canción, y la comedia de Anfitrión. End of the title. Here, Villalobos combines poetry and prose with essays on medicine, natural and moral philosophy, recreational prose fiction, autobiographical episodes, and letters by himself and others too. It also contains his translation of Plautus' Amphitryon with our physician's comments, most of which moralize the comedy or provide contextual and background information. And more relevant for my purposes here today, there are other comments to Plotters Play, in his translation, such as his long gloss on the physiology and psychology of fear and cowardice, which explore the relations between clinical pathology and moral philosophy within a social and political context. Los Problemas was published in Zaragoza in 1544, although it seems that there was a previous edition published in Zamora in 1543. No copy has survived of that edition, if it ever existed. The thing is that it remained in print throughout the 16th century. It went through 4 different reprints until the end of the 16th century. This book runs parallel with the heteroglossia of his fellow physician, François Rabelais, or the satiric parodies of Francisco Delicado's La Lozana Andaluza. La Lozana Andaluza is a fascinating novel whose language exhibits the polyglot atmosphere of Rome and the Mediterranean world in the early 16th century. Los Problemas and its combination of scholarly material with lighter contents much have reached a readership well beyond specialized audiences. It also represents Villalobos' transition from the courtly circles within which his letters and other manuscripts circulated to the larger public sphere facilitated by print. The opening pages of Los Problemas deal with the cosmos. Each of its sections is preceded by a short poem where the main doctrine is encapsulated, followed by a gloss in prose. The second treatise, which has the same structure, descends from the cosmos to man. It deals with las costumbres humanas. And here Villalobos describes and analyzes a large variety of social types, from common soldiers to great lords, whose social parasitism he criticizes, as well as princes, ladies, knights, and the clergy. In another section of Los Problemas, Villalobos recounts an autobiographical episode that exemplifies his combination of recreational prose with social critique within the framework of an essay on moral philosophy. He tells his readers about the tricks he had used to flee from the French in the midst of battle. He also describes the attitude of 2 gentlemen who behaved even more cowardly than he did on the same occasion, and suggests that these 2 gentlemen also approached him one night in a dark alley to interrogate Villalobos about his ancestors, an episode that clearly smacks of anti-Semitism. He refrains from giving, of course, any names or any further details, and subtly leaves the interpretation of this episode and the moral lesson to be drawn from it to his readers. Y esto baste, he says, para declaración del metro pasado. This should be enough by way of a comment for the point that I have just offered you. But this combination of innuendo, humor, irony, and bitterness is typical of much of Villalobos' prose. It also became an indispensable strategy in other varieties of prose fiction like the picaresque, which were frequently rather critical of social and political practices and of clerical corruption. In Metro 11 and its gloss, Villalobos uses again indirection and confusion to cast a smoke screen on what can be read as an attack on empire and the ancient aristocracy. Villalobos' prose here constantly oscillates from praise to barely disguised satire. One encomiastic statement quickly undermines the expectation it has just created by coming up with a damning assertion, only to master another period in which copious praise re-emerges to neutralize the radical critique that has just been dropped. This is then immediately followed by another radical declaration, which is in turn denied. Side by side with these moral treatises, Los Problemas also contains a humorous dialogue framed within an epistolary exchange between Villalobos and Alonso de Fonseca, the dedicatee of his comments on Pliny. Fonseca had requested from the doctor an account of a conversation that he had with one of his patients. The device through which the narrator recounts his case in a letter at the request of his correspondent is identical to the narrative framework used by the anonymous author of Lazarillo de Tormes. The first Spanish picaresque novel appears as an autobiographical letter penned by the narrator and protagonist in response to a correspondent who wants to know about his case in detail. Villalobos' dialogue is a display of his narrative panoply. It features practical jokes, the adventures of the Count of Benavente with an enigma, half scientific, half revelation discussions on the different types of drinking vessels for wine and for medicaments, and their effects as regards the production of bodily gases. This dialogue is then followed by a most serious essay on las tres grandes, that is, the three great passions of loquacity, obstinacy, and laughter. La gran parlería, la gran porfía, y la gran risa. Our physician admits the methodological challenge that he must face, since these three great passions straddle the realms of clinical pathology, the body, psychology, the soul, and the social sphere, moral philosophy. All three combined, he says, produce mild amusement, but also grief. This essay concentrates Villalobos' experience with the great and the powerful. It is an eloquent testimony of his skills and as an observer of the pageant of human types and passions that can always be found in high places. Let me just give you what I find is one of the most remarkable texts that Villalobos ever wrote, which is his description of false laughter. And I quote, "This sort of laughter is a passion proper of a wild animal called the cord. This is a beast that laughs continually without having a will to do so. It has 2,000 or 3,000 mouths, all of them laughing immoderately. Some of them are toothless, like the mouths of masks. Others have fangs like dogs. Others laugh from ear to ear, as in a bear's skull. Some others frown just like buttonholes. Some have beards, others are shaven. Some are masculine, others feminine. Some shout, and some are voiceless. Others growl, and others vomit. Some laugh with a closed mouth. Others are reprehensive. Some are blonde, and some are dark. It is indeed worthy of contemplation, not as a group of human beings, but as the many different members of one and the same animal." End of quote. He concludes this section with a typology of courtiers who parade before the reader as characters classified according to the type of laughter they either display or elicit. Let me finally return in the last part of my paper today to the intellectual background that I mentioned at the beginning. For this common ground that Villalobos shared with other humanists also interconnects his correspondence, his commentaries on Pliny, his medical works, his peculiar Problemas, and his translation of Plautus' Amphitryon with the topic of our colloquium today, the circulation of knowledge. Villalobos shared with some of his fellow humanists their reprobation of the unintelligible prose of the scholastics, and their defense of a polished and elegant, yet common and plain style. There could be no clear and proper knowledge in any discipline without a new type of prose cleansed of all the barbaric Latin and the conceptual jargon of the scholastics. In Metro 35 of his Problemas, Villalobos also criticized the nominales. Their subtleties, he says, are so weak and vacuous that, like a spider web, their fabric is good for nothing. This path had already been trodden by compatriots like Elio Antonio Enebrija or Juan Luis Vives, the humanist himself, whose book In Pseudo-Dialecticos, published in 1519, decried the deterministic logic that he knew so well. For Vives was educated in Paris at the Collège de Montaigu around 1514, whose rector was the determinist Jean Maire. This college was also the butt of Rabelais' parody in Gargantua and Pantagruel, where he attributed to Maire the authorship of a non-existent treatise titled De Modo Faciendi Budinos, in translation, on making sausages. This parody appears in a catalogue of books that Pantagruel saw in the famous Library of St. Victor. And the interesting thing about this catalogue, which is quite well known, is that it combines true books that actually existed with crazy invented titles. One of the invented titles is a treatise called, or titled, Whether a Chimera Humming in the Void Can Dine on Second Instantions, a Most Delicate Question Debated for 10 Weeks at the Council of Constance. So next to the skeptic strain found in Pliny and his Epicureanism, this anti-scholastic ethos is an important part of Villalobos and his background. It constitutes the foundation of a profound epistemological reform of language that affected all sorts of discipline, from natural to moral philosophy, from political discourse to theology. It also spread to the didactic prose that should promote these ideas in the new public sphere of print. In very rough terms, really rough, we can say that two types of prose fiction resulted from this background. One was the parodic and wildly inventive fiction of Rabelais, or La Lozana Andaluza, right? And Villalobos, as we have seen, produced samples of this type, you know, the grotesque description of false laughter, right? Or in the constantly shifting prose of his critique of empire and aristocracy, which I have quoted before. The other type of prose was the realism that emerged as a very similar counterpart to the fantasies of chivalry and romance. Villalobos also produced some samples of this. One of them was his translation of Plautus. For the combination of epistolar rhetoric that came from the Ars Dictaminis, right, and the humanist tradition of letter writing, the combination of that tradition in prose with the urban dialogues of middle and lower class characters found in Plautus and Terence contributed to furnish a new idiom for the very similar dialogism of early modern prose fiction. This new style emerged within foundational works like Piccolomini's Historia de Duobus Amantibus, the history of two lovers, which in turn was highly influential upon La Celestina. The Historia de Duobus Amantibus was translated just 2 or 3 years into Spanish, 2 or 3 years before the first known edition of La Celestina, and there are scholars that suggest that Fernando de Rojas, the author of La Celestina, was a translator of the Historia de Duobus Amantibus. We do have the smoking gun, which points that, you know, if it wasn't Rojas, it was someone in his circle. But the similarity of the prose, both in the translation of the Historia de Duobus Amantibus and La Celestina, is quite remarkable, and they are both of very high quality. And then this prose, the Historia Duobus Amantibus and La Celestina, it evolved towards the critical realism of the picaresque. The very similar depiction of the social landscape that we find in many of these works appears in combination with a penchant for essayistic digression, for the interpolation of micro-narratives, and for the satural combination of serious with light matter. If we add the first-person autobiographical narrator, we have already most, if not all, of the ingredients that led to the development of the picaresque. From the self-contained Erasmianism of Lazarillo de Tormes to the exuberance of Guzmán de Alfarache about 50 years later, where the narrator regales his readers with humorous episodes alternated with digressive essays on a large variety of topics. There are historians of the picaresque like Björnson, who have pointed out that some European translators of Spanish picaresque fiction, he is referring to a German 17th century translator, exploited this format, and I quote Björnson, as a means of stringing together expository pieces, unquote. Which again points to the affinities between moral and natural philosophy and the intermixing of essayistic prose with recreational prose fiction, of which Villalobos, I think, is an early example. Another antecedent for this type of novel is the conversational letter, what Fernando Lázaro Carreter calls the carta colloquium. And Fernando Lázaro Carretera, an important historian of Spanish literature in general, Golden Age literature, and in particular of the picaresque, he has an important book on the picaresque. So Lázaro Carretera uses Villalobos' correspondence to illustrate the sort of context, the seed bed, as it were, that facilitated the emergence of Lazarillo de Tormes. The corpus of Villalobos' correspondence is also an excellent example of how the manuscript circulation of letters, which were meant for semi-private communication between individuals or within a coterie of courtiers, broke into the public sphere of print and was thus made available to a much wider middle-class readership. I would like to conclude today by proposing that Villalobos can be read as a catalogue that displays the variety of prose in circulation at the time. He also illustrates the scientific and epistemological concerns that underlie the gradual emergence of the modern novel and its languages. In particular, that intersection of natural and moral philosophy, of pathology and psychology that furnished the studies of characters and the description of social landscapes that inhabited the picaresque. Thank you very much.